Well, hello, everyone, and welcome in to another week of our psychoeducation group on grief. It's been a couple of weeks since I've done one of these videos. Had a really busy last week and a half or so. My son was born last Wednesday, August 21st. And so we went in to the hospital on Tuesday night. So I was real busy, wasn't able to do this group. And it's just, again, it's been a real busy time, a real happy time. Been spending a lot of time with family here and helping my wife out around the house. But it's our second child, and he's healthy, he's good, and we're glad to be back. This is actually going to be our last session for this group. And I thought what we could do here is just kind of sum up everything that we've talked about. And I wanted to do that for a couple of reasons. Number one, I wanted to do it just to kind of refresh you on all the things that we've talked about. We've done 7 sessions now. And so just to kind of refresh everybody, to let everybody look back at what we've talked about, to hopefully remember some of the things we talked about, particularly at the beginning, because we might have forgotten some of those things. Secondly, wanted to do this just so you could have an all-in-one video to refer to and come back to. It has kind of all the resources that we've talked about and a lot of different things that you could work with here. So that's kind of why I'm doing it this way, a summary of our grief group. I've really enjoyed doing this. I hope it's been helpful for you, and hopefully, you can share these videos with people. At least point people to these videos rather, for those who are going through loss. Again, we've said it affects a lot of people, and people are in need of help. And so maybe some of this could be passed on to others. So let's go ahead and start doing this. Now, I will say this has the potential to be kind of long just because we're kind of summing up everything in one. And I'm going to try to keep it relatively short. I don't know. It's probably not going to be short. Let's just throw that out. But we're going to try to get through this and just kind of, go through each thing that we've talked about. So the first thing we did was kind of do an overview of grief. And we just kind of looked at what grief is. And so this was a quote from Smith et al., Smith and others on helpguide.org. They say this: grief is a natural response to loss. It's the emotional suffering you feel when someone or something or someone you love is taken away. Often, the pain of loss can feel overwhelming. You may experience all kinds of difficult and unexpected emotions, from shock or anger to disbelief, guilt, and profound sadness. So that was I thought, a pretty good encompassing definition of what grief is: a natural response to loss. It's normal to have grief after you lose something or someone important to you, and it can take a lot of different forms. Like um, shock, anger, disbelief, guilt, so on and so forth. And it's something that a lot of people face, right? These feelings of grief, and again, it's normal to have sadness, or to be feel guilty, or to be in disbelief after losing something really important. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about grief, is that response to a loss. That's really what we're looking at, and all the feelings that come with that. So kind of title onto this was looking at what grief and bereavement are. These words are kind of used interchangeably, but they're actually a little bit different. Bereave means to deprive of something. You're depriving somebody of something when you're bereaving them. This is Merriam-Webster, by the way. Grief means deep and poignant distress caused by or as if by bereavement. So it's the bereavement, to be deprived of something, that causes the distress. So it's not the exact same thing, but a lot of times they are used interchangeably. But bereave is kind of the action of depriving of something. It's the actual losing of something, and the grief is the deep and poignant distress, the distressing feelings that come by being deprived. So they are very similar. They're very much intertwined, but they're not exactly the same thing. Another word you'll get here is mourning, and we probably should have put mourning here. Mourning is really those intense feelings of sadness, and so that's pretty much what grief is. Pretty close to grief. I'd say it's closer than bereavement is. But I just wanted to throw that out there too, because some of these terms are interchangeable. Um, So here's another quote on grief and bereavement. Researchers have suggested that the term bereavement be used to refer to the fact of the loss. So the loss taking place, that's bereavement. The term grief should then be used to describe the emotional, cognitive, functional, and behavioral responses to the death. So the response to the death is grief. The actual death or the loss taking place is the bereavement. So you can kind of see the differences there. Then we talked about in that first session the misconceptions about grief. And there's a lot out there, and I'll just run through these very quickly. This is not an exhaustive list. Number one is grief only occurs after losing a loved one. And that's just not true. Absolutely, grief does occur after losing a loved one. And I would say that's probably one of the main times when it does occur is after losing a loved one. But it can take place after losing a job, after losing a home, after losing something else that's really special to you. That grief can occur. It's not just only after losing somebody that's close to you or losing a loved one. Um, and that's a misconception about grief. Grief can happen after many different things in life. Number two, everyone grieves the same. That is simply not true. People go at different paces, people feel things differently. There's obviously some overlap, right? There's going to be sadness pretty much across the board and losing a loved one or losing something important to you. But the intensity of that sadness or the duration of that sadness might be different, right? And some people might not even appear sad. It's just how they deal with it differently. So everyone does not grieve the same, and you don't have to. You may have seen somebody grieve, and maybe now you're grieving. You may think, well, that person went through this and I need to be going through it too. And that's not necessarily true. Everyone is unique and everyone has unique experiences, and that includes with loss. And so you're not going to grieve the same as somebody else. Um, Number three is ignoring grief helps it go away. So there's kind of this idea that, if I just put this off to the side, then it'll be fine. Out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. And really, that's not going to be helpful because that's still going to be creeping there in the back of your mind. It's still going to be there, right? Those feelings are still there. The root of it all is still there. And so ignoring it is not going to help it go away. It's really just refusing to face what's there in front of you. It's refusing to face the struggle. And the only way we can really get through it is if we actually face it head on. And I know that's difficult. It's hard to hear. It's hard to do. But it's really what we do have to do is take it head on and attack it. And ignoring it is going to really just let it simmer, and it's not going to help us overcome the negative feelings. It's almost like putting a band-aid on it, a temporary fix. It's not going to be permanent. No, number four, grief is linear. What we mean by that is I think some people think that you move through grief in a certain way, and it's always going to be kind of an upward climb. It hurts at first, but you're going to get better, and it's just going to go in a line. And that's just not true. Some people, they do get better very quickly, and then they may take a step back into sadness some more. Some people, they stay in intense sadness or in anger for a while, and it takes them a while to get to another stage. We'll look at stages of grief here in just a minute, but it's not just this process that's pretty and tightly packed and neatly packed. I mean, and everybody goes through it the same way. It's not linear, right? Some days are going to be better than others. You might have a really great week, and then it's really bad the next. So it's not a linear thing. It's kind of like more ups and downs, a lot of hills and valleys. It's good times and bad times and good, so on and so forth. So grief is not linear. Number five here is moving on with your life means forgetting about the loss, right? That is a misconception, right? You can get to the point where you move on with your life, but you integrate that loss into your life and you carry whatever you lost with you and you create meaning out of that. And you use it in life as a lesson, right? So moving on with your life does not mean you forget about the loss or that it doesn't mean anything to you. That's not true. Really, what we want to do is get to the point where we can move on with life, accept the loss, integrate it into our lives, and move on in a healthy manner. And we'll talk more about this here in a little bit about accepting the loss when we get to the stages of grief. But I think some people, are hesitant to move on or to get better because they think that if they get better, then they're letting go of what they've lost, and that's not true. It's not true. You can move on and still carry that person or that thing with you and integrate it into the rest of your life. And finally, here, there's only one type of grief. I think, again, we've kind of already touched on this, but there are many different types of grief. And we'll look at that here in just a moment. But it's not just, um, one type of grief and everybody's going to feel the same type of grief. There are different types of grief. And we're going to look at those different types here in just a second. So those are some misconceptions about grief. And again, not an exhaustive list, but just some that we went over several weeks ago. Now, here are some types of grief, the different types of grief. Number one is acute grief. And by the way, let me just go ahead and say the first two are just kind of, um, I guess maybe shouldn't be considered, I guess, types of grief. It's just kind of like almost more like stages, really. But what I'm putting them here, anyways, and I think you'll kind of see what we're talking about here. But acute grief is the initial grief response to the loss that typically involves a host of negative symptoms. So it's kind of like the initial response when you lose something or somebody important to you. What's your initial response? And it's those sharp feelings, those acute feelings of denial or shock and anger, and it's kind of that initial response to the loss that can be really, really strong. Integrated grief is a lasting form of grief in which an individual has come to terms with the new reality and has learned to integrate the loss into their life. So, we were kind of just touching on that a few minutes ago about accepting the loss and moving on with your life. Acute grief is that initial response. Integrated grief is the point where we want to get to eventually, where we've come to terms with the loss. It's happened. It's a new reality, and we've learned to integrate it into our lives and carry it with us. And so, yeah, sort of types of grief here, but really that kind of fits on that stages of grief continuum, which we'll look at here in a minute. Really, some types of grief here would be, and this the last one and on the other slides, complicated grief is one. This is where it's like a really prolonged and intense feelings of grief in which an individual is just unable to adapt to the loss and continues to experience these negative symptoms. So it's almost like somebody continues to experience acute grief over and over again, and they cannot seem to overcome. They cannot seem to get over these feelings of anger or sadness or depression, right? They're just unable to do it, and they stay in this cycle of grief, and they're stuck in it, and they can't integrate it. They can't accept it. And so it's almost again like the acute grief, those initial responses that are really intense and have a lot of negative symptoms. It's almost like that continues on and the person can't overcome. And that's when somebody really, really is going to need a professional help, like a therapist, a counselor, really going to need some help to help them through the complications with their grief. Some more types of grief here. Number one is absent grief. So this is a form of complicating grief in which an individual shows little to no signs of distress regarding the loss. So this is a really tough one. All of them are tough, but this one's really, really strange, actually. That, when somebody should grieve, there are actually no signs of grief or very little signs of grief in the person. Now, it doesn't mean that um, the feelings aren't there, but it's like they kind of are almost like stunned, and it's almost like they cannot show the grief. And so it's absent grief. And again, that's a really, really tough position to be in when you're, kind of expected to be sad, and it hurts and it's painful, but the person is just not able to really show any of those signs or shows very little signs. That's a type of grief, absent grief. Disenfranchised or silent grief. This is grief that occurs when individuals feel they need to hide their grief from others and therefore keep their feelings inside. So this is kind of like the grief where someone may not feel like it's, as big as maybe like losing a loved one, right? They may be grieving something else, and it's like, well, I need to keep this to myself because it's really not all that big, or really people are not going to notice my grief and really not think that it's all that important. I think an example that people sometimes give on this is, somebody who has like a miscarriage, right? um, miscarriages are really tough. Those are little precious beings being created in the womb of a mother. But I think sometimes, there's this idea that, um, well, it was early on, so it's not as bad as losing a baby later on in the term, or losing a child, once they're born, or years, when they're a couple years old or whatever. And so some may feel like they can't share that. But folks, that's tough. Losing a child at any point in the process, having a miscarriage, is really tough. But I think some women may keep that inside and feel like, well, I don't need to share this. People won't really care. People won't really recognize. And so they keep it to themselves. And that's hard, right? That's difficult to deal with. Really, really hurts. And so disenfranchised or silent grief is one where people feel the need to hide their grief, and therefore they keep those feelings inside. A couple of other types of grief: anticipatory grief. So this is a grief that occurs when expecting a loss. So the classic example here is when, like, a family member is, like, terminally ill, and that they've been given like 6 months to live, or whatever it may be. And it's that grief where it's coming, and you're anticipating those feelings, those things of the feelings of sadness and pain and so on and so forth. That's anticipatory grief, when something is coming, and that hurts. It's hard to deal with. Collective grief. This is a grief that is experienced by a community in response to a loss or a negative event. That says even there, but it should say event. So something like a natural disaster, right, that tears through a town and maybe takes lives and takes homes, things like that. That can bring about collective grief, where people have a collective response of sadness and hurt to some type of event. Even when, like, a celebrity dies, like Kobe Bryant. I had mentioned this several months ago in that lesson when we were going over this. When Kobe died, the whole NBA community, the National Basketball Association, everybody was hurt. And it was like this collective grief about him dying. So those are the different types of grief that we went over. So in the next week, that was the first one was looking at the misconceptions about grief, what grief is, and the different types of grief. The second week, we looked at the stages of grief. And the stages of grief are different models that people have proposed, Kubler-Ross being one of them. Probably the most popular stages of grief model was from Kubler-Ross. And these models are just basically a framework to give us a look at the different feelings, the different things that people will experience along the grief journey. Now, here's what this is not. This is not again, a thing to say, well, this is what grief has to look like, or this is a neatly packaged way of grieving that everybody goes through. That's not what this is. This is really, again, just a framework to help us understand what grief looks like in many people, and what the stages that people are going to pass through. And here's the thing: it's not linear all the time. What we mean by that is not everybody goes from denial to anger to bargaining to depression to acceptance. What some people may do is go from denial to anger to bargaining, back to anger, back to denial, jumping to, depression, and then acceptance, right? And then, it can be all these different types of again, hills and valleys, or going to the next stage and then going back, right? It's not always this neatly packaged thing that everybody goes through the exact same way. And sometimes people may even skip an entire stage. This is just kind of, again, a framework to help us understand what most people go through when they grieve. So that's what we wanted to look at here, were Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. We looked at a couple different ones, but we're not going to look at all of the different stages of grief we models that we went over. We'll look at two here, but this is probably the most famous one, Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. Number one, the first stage is denial, and that's those feelings of shock and denial tied to the loss. So it's kind of like this idea, like, that didn't just happen, or there's no way that this just happened. I'll wake up one day and the person I lost will be in bed with me, or will be in the house somewhere, right? It's all a bad dream. That's kind of the first stage, the stage of denial, and feeling shocked by what had happened. So that's kind of the first stage in Kubler-Ross's model. And you can imagine a lot of people going through that, like losing something so important to you, something that's always been there, been a part of you, and now it's not, right? So um, denial is the first stage. Second stage is anger. It's the feelings of anger, resentment, bitterness, these intense feelings, um, these intense negative feelings where you're really upset by the loss. You're feeling angry because you lost something. You're holding resentment in your heart because of the loss, or bitterness because somebody else didn't lose something, right? And you had to go through this, and it makes you mad. It makes you stew in your anger. And that's kind of the second stage that Kubler-Ross pointed out that many people face is anger, these feelings of anger, resentment, and bitterness. The third stage is bargaining. And this is the stage that's characterized by trying to change the outcomes or try to feel less pain. So it's almost like you're trying to make deals with yourself or with God, or a higher power to change what has happened, or to feel less pain. It's almost like kind of like, God, if you will bring this person back, well, I'll live my life for you. Or if you'll just help this pain go away, I will do A, B, C, or D. If only you do this, God, and I will do that. And so it's kind of like bargaining to change what has happened. Um, Again, most of the time this is irrational, and it's things that are not going to happen. But that is a stage that people pass through. They're trying to win back what they've lost, and so they start to bargain. Depression is the next one, the next stage here, and that's these feelings of deep sadness and withdrawal because of the loss. And folks, this is a pretty normal thing to be sad and to want to withdraw from people because of losing something, right? It's not easy to lose something important to you, to lose something that you had and that you were so close to, or that you were so closely tied to, and to feel sadness is a normal thing, and to want to withdraw from life and to be kind of by yourself is a normal thing. In fact, all of these things are normal. These are not things that are bad to feel, bad to go through. It's normal to lose something important to you is really, really hard. And it's going to be accompanied by these types of things. But depression is one of those stages that Kubler-Ross identified. Another one was acceptance. That's the final stage where people accept the loss and they integrate it into their lives. And that's kind of what we've already touched on. But that's the point we want to get to, where we realize, you know, this has happened. We come to terms with this loss, and we're never going to get back what we've lost, but we can still carry it with us in our lives. We can still make meaning out of what we've lost some way or some shape, form, or fashion. And that's really where we want to get to. And sometimes it takes a long time for people to get there. Sometimes it's a little bit quicker for others, but it's your own pace. It's not something that you have to get through in a certain amount of time, right? It's different for each person. But that's Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. Again, probably the most famous model for these stages of grief. Another one that we talked about was William Worden's tasks of mourning. He had kind of come up with some similar stages, but he called them tasks. Basically tasks that people have to do in order to overcome loss. And number one is accept the reality of the loss. So it's kind of, in the last stage was those feelings of shock and denial. Here with William Worden, he basically says you've got to overcome those feelings of denial and shock. You've got to accept the reality that it has happened. In order to overcome, you've got to accept the reality of the loss, and that makes sense, right? Accepting the reality of a loss, it can be hard, but it is what we have to get to at some point in order to get better. Now, I will say denial and shock actually can serve a helpful purpose for a short time, because it's kind of a buffer for what's coming, right? We feel these feelings of shock and denial that this really didn't happen. And again, it's almost like a buffer before these other stages hit. But Worden is right in saying that at some point we have to come to terms with the reality of what has happened. Task two is process the pain of grief. And so this is where, instead of ignoring it, instead of just putting it off, it's really accepting what has happened and processing those feelings, like letting yourself feel what has occurred and what you're feeling inside, and really processing through it. And we really do that a lot in counseling, just processing with people what they've been through, what's gone on, and so. You have to allow yourself to feel and allow yourselves to kind of just process, to sit back and just really think about what you're feeling, what you're going through. Number three is adjusting to a world without the deceased. And this is A hard reality is that when you lose someone or something important to you, things change. Life roles change. Routines are going to change. Things are going to be different. And so adjusting to a world is really important. Adjusting to a world without the deceased, without whatever you lost. That's kind of that other task, that next step to take to overcome mourning and grief, um, is adjusting. And some people have a really tough time adjusting, have a really hard time overcoming their feelings, and uh, overcoming without that person there, that thing that they've lost. But that's important to overcome these feelings of grief. Task four is find an enduring connection with the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life. And so this is where, you have meaning making again, where you build a connection with whoever you've lost or whatever you've lost while moving on in your life. Again, it's like just because you move on in life doesn't mean you've forgotten or that you don't think it's important or whatever you lost, right? It still is important to you. And it's still a part of you. And so you can find that connection with whatever you've lost and integrate it into your life while embarking on a new journey. And so that's task four. And these again are William Worden's tasks of mourning. Again, it's not always task one, two, three, and four. It may look different for each person. Each person may take a different amount of time to get through these different tasks. But that's kind of what we went over in the second week. And I wanted to go over that because just kind of gives us again a framework for what to look for, what to look at with grief, and what we can expect to see in grief um, when people have lost something important to them. So that's the second week. The third week, we went over coping. So what do we need to do when we grieve? What do we turn to? That's what a coping mechanism really is. Anything that we use to help us through the negative things in life, right? The negative experience. What do we turn to help us get through? To help us again, to help us cope with the negative things. And so we looked at some maladaptive coping mechanisms. And in other words, what are the things that are going to be really dangerous and harmful to us if we do them after loss? Well, number one is substance use, right? A lot of people turn to doing drugs, alcohol, um, you know, overdosing on prescription drugs, things like that, to kind of get their minds off of the pain, the hurt. And folks, that's actually just going to exacerbate the problem, right? Substance use, alcohol, drugs, those things are not going to address the deep rooted issues. Are not going to help you address what's going on and the feelings that you're feeling, the things that you're going through. It may mask it for a second, but again, it's a temporary fix. And I would actually say this, it's really not even a fix at all. Really, substance use is really going to hurt you more in the long run and lead to more problems and lead to more pain in the end. And so, substance use is one of those maladaptive coping mechanisms that we want to stay away from at all costs. Self harm. Self harm is another one that people turn to, to again maybe get their minds off of it, to focus on some physical pain sensation, get their minds off of the emotional pain and hurt. And so they self harm. And that is, again, another dangerous thing that is not going to address the deep rooted issues or not going to help you through the tough things that are going on inside. It's really going to hurt you further and literally hurt you physically, and could really lead to some really dangerous health issues. So be very, very careful and stay away from self harm at all costs. But some people are kind of drive themselves to that because they're so sad, they're so hurt, and so they end up doing things like self harm. Addictive behaviors, and I know these other two kind of could have fallen under that, but we're talking about things also kind of like gambling would be example here, or shopping, turning to things like that to again get your mind off of it. But like those things are going to really be harmful and really hurt your bank account, and not be good for you in the long run, and again get you hooked on something else, and it's not going to address those deep seated, deep rooted issues. Risky behaviors, this is I think some of the things we've talked about would go in along with that, but when people are sad they may kind of turn to doing some things that are real risky. One a simple example would be, like sleeping around, right? I'm so hurt, I'm in so much pain, I'm just gonna sleep with whoever, and have this high with somebody, and feel this pleasurable experience with someone to get my mind off of it. But again, that's very risky and can bring on a lot of other things that you're not prepared to deal with when you're dealing with loss. That's just one example. I think gambling would be a risky behavior. Going out and shopping and spending all you have in your bank account, those are risky behaviors. But again, we kind of touched on those with the addictive behaviors as well. Binge eating. Some people kind of turn to eating during this time, and I could also just say unhealthy eating, right? We need to make sure that we're eating healthy, that we're not putting bad foods in our bodies, especially when we're down, when we're sad. That's going to lead to more problems, especially binge eating, right? When we are just so caught up in our feelings and our sadness that we just eat, 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 and eat, and eat to the point where we've binged, and then we may go and throw it all up, right? And again, that's not going to address the deep issues that are going on. It's really going to cause more problems in the end. Avoidance and withdrawal is another maladaptive coping mechanism. Avoidance being, staying, this could be a couple of things here: avoidance and withdrawal, withdrawing from people and kind of just spending all your time alone, and withdrawing socially, avoiding people, avoiding situations or social events. But it could also be avoiding or withdrawing from your own feelings, right? Avoiding the things that you're feeling and not facing them. Again, we kind of talked about this, that um, a problem can actually be when we don't face up with the things that we are going through, um, and not actually just kind of go at it head on. So avoidance and withdrawal is really going to hurt in the long run. And then procrastination, putting things off, and that's kind of goes along with avoidance and withdrawal there. But these things are not going to be helpful. These are maladaptive coping mechanisms. Not an exhaustive list. Again, there's a lot more out there that we could talk about, but this is just some things that are really not going to help in the end, that are really going to actually cause more problems and more pain in the long run. Here's some positive coping mechanisms, adaptive coping mechanisms. Number one is regular exercise. Again, when we are hurting, when we're in pain, we don't want to get out and do things. Sometimes we have to force ourselves and to get exercise, or to just get up and get going out throughout the day. But getting regular exercise, there's no way to really put into words how helpful exercise can be for us, how good it is for our bodies, for our minds. There's so many benefits. It helps our hearts, our lungs, it helps our minds, it helps relieve stress. So exercising, even if it's hard, even when you don't want to get up, get out of bed and get going, man, this could be really, really helpful. So exercise regularly, even through tough times. 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night. We need to be getting good rest. And again, when we're hurting, when we're in pain, some people struggle to rest, and don't get enough sleep. Some people are on the other side where they sleep too much, and they're in the bed all day, and that's just as bad. That's why I put 7 to 8 hours. We want a good amount of sleep, right there, kind of in the middle. 6 to 8 hours is kind of or 6 to 9. You hear different different numbers from different sources about how much sleep we should get. But 7 to 8 hours of sleep, I think, is really, really helpful, really, really important to get. And so aim for that. And if you're struggling to sleep, look into maybe getting some supplements, maybe look into getting some more help from a professional. A healthy diet. We've kind of already touched on that when we talked about binge eating as a maladaptive coping mechanism and eating unhealthy foods. I mean, it's literally proven that the things we put in our body literally affect us and affect our energy levels, our attitudes, and things like that. Right? If we eat healthy, we're going to feel better, and so we want to have a healthy diet. I mean, it's hard to do when we're feeling sad and hurt and anxious and lonely, and so we need to make sure that we are engaging in a healthy diet. Engage in hobbies. One thing again that we may do when we are sad or hurting is withdraw and not really do anything. But we need to make sure that we're continuing to do things that we enjoy doing. And again, that may seem counterproductive. It may seem like I don't want to do this right now because I'm hurting. But folks, we can't just stop. We need to keep pressing on, and engaging in things that we enjoy doing can really be helpful for us in the long run. Religious practices. We'll talk about this in one of the last slides, that faith and religion has been shown to be helpful for those who are grieving. And those who are grieving and are tied to religion in some way or faith in some way tend to overcome quicker than those who are not tied to faith or religion. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Social activities. Again, we want to withdraw from people when we're hurt, when we're struggling, but we need that connection. We were made to be in connection with other people. We were made to be a part of with others, to be a part in relationships with others. And so when we have that connection, we will feel better. And I'm not saying like you lose somebody and you immediately go to a party. Like that's probably not helpful. What I'm talking about is over the course of time, we start withdrawing and we're never around people. We're always alone. That's dangerous. We need to be around people, have that social connection. Humor, a little bit of laughter is really really good for us, and it helps us emotionally. And so maybe watch a funny movie or some type of comedy bit or something like that, or do something that makes you laugh. And again, maybe spending time with people, your best friends, they make you laugh. Support groups. There are a lot of groups out there for those who are grieving. Get out there and get involved with a group that is focused on helping those who are grieving. I hear people say when they join a group, they're hesitant at first, but when they do, they end up saying that it's some of the best, that one of the best things that they ever chose to do was to be involved in a group and um, to be involved in a group and to work through the grief with others. And that also helps you with social activities, social connection is getting in a group with other people working through grief. And finally, counseling. Counseling can really help you cope with your grief and the things that you're feeling. Counselors are professionally equipped to help you, and that's what we do. That's what we work for a living for, is to help people through their the things that they're struggling with. And so, um, getting into counseling may be something that you find helpful, and that you could work through that grief with a counselor. So those are some adaptive coping mechanisms. Again, not an exhaustive list, just some things that you could do to help you during your time of grief to get through. So that was I think the third session there. The fourth session, well, hold on, I'm jumping ahead. I'm sorry, I can't actually see my next slides. In that session about coping, we also talked about some actual exercises that you can do, and we practiced one, and I botched it in that group a couple weeks ago when I was trying to practice this with you. But square breathing is a practice that can really help you kind of ground yourself when you're feeling really overwhelmed. Square breathing can kind of center you and root you and ground you in the present. And really, when we take a deep breath, it really is helpful. But you breathe in for 4 seconds, you hold it for 4 seconds, you breathe out for 4 seconds, then you hold for 4 seconds, and you just keep repeating and you just keep going with that. That's square breathing, and it can really, really just kind of give you like a reset almost. We went over other exercises too, but I'm not going to go over any more. We talked about some grounding exercises. You can go back and look at those videos, but I just wanted to give you one example of something that you could do or pass along to someone who is grieving and who needs some help. Something simple like this could improve their day, even if it's just by a little bit. In the fourth session, we talked about triggers. Now, I meant to talk about that with the previous stuff, the coping, but I missed that, and so I talked about it in the next week. But triggers are any stimulus that brings about a reaction, so or a sensory reminder of the loss, and they typically cause significant negative emotional responses. So it could be something like you hear a song that reminds you of the person that you lost, right? And that brings on those really intense feelings of sadness and wishing that you had that person back. Even a certain like place, like you go to a restaurant that was maybe your place with your spouse or whatnot. And it brings about those feelings like you smell the meal that they used to love, or you're sitting at the booth that you always used to sit at, right? So those things are triggers, and it's really anything that kind of reminds you of the loss, and it can happen at any time. And so you have to be prepared for those triggers to come up and to induce those negative feelings. So how do you handle grief triggers? Number one, you got to identify the triggers. Start recognizing, okay, what are the things, the places, the smells, the songs, the whatever it may be that are going to trigger me. identify those so that you can be prepared not to necessarily avoid them, because we don't always want to avoid, right? I'm not saying that you necessarily intentionally want to go to a certain place that's going to trigger you, but sometimes you can't stay away from it. And avoidance can actually be negative in the long run, where we're not actually facing what we're going through. But what we need to do is identify the trigger so that we can be ready to face it when it comes, when we do have to face those situations or those things that are going to trigger us. So identify those triggers. Then pause and give yourself space to process, right? When you're triggered, you can get really, really worked up quickly, and it's almost like a snowball, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. But you need to pause and give yourself space to process. Take a deep breath. Give yourself space to process. Think about what you're feeling. Name it. Name it. I'm feeling sad right now. I'm feeling hurt right now. This is the spot where we always used to go. This was our song, or whatever it may be. Pause. Don't let yourself start snowballing. Um, Pause and give yourself space to process. Then practice adaptive coping techniques. So we talked about a few seconds ago with the maladaptive and adaptive coping mechanisms. You need to practice some adaptive coping techniques, like that square breathing, like those grounding techniques. Maybe even take out your notes app or something and journal something down. Right, practice those adaptive coping techniques, and then finally seek support when you're triggered. Call a friend, call a counselor, call your a parent or something like that. Whatever it may be, seek support from somebody. Seek support from God. Start praying. Do something to kind of get some help when you're feeling really overwhelmed. So those are just some things about triggers and how to handle those triggers. We then went into talking about grief counseling, I think in the fourth or fifth session, and just kind of to give you an overview of what it's going to look like if you come to counseling. And we went over that to try to kind of demystify counseling. Some people are kind of scared to get into counseling and scared of, well, I'm going to be different if I go to counseling, or something's wrong with me if I go to counseling. And I wanted to demystify that idea, that counseling is bad, or you're wrong, or that something's wrong with you because you go to counseling. Folks, it's actually a sign, I think, a strength if you recognize you need help and you need to overcome, and with the help of somebody else, right? I think it shows a sign of a strength, that you recognize that you need help and that you want to get better. And so counseling can be really helpful. And I also want to just kind of give you a view of what it's going to look like when you come in. What are some things you can expect? So, grief counseling helps people work through feelings, behaviors, and thoughts connected to the loss through various methods. So, what a grief counselor is going to do, and again, some counselors specialize in grief counseling. Like, that's exactly what they do. And sometimes that's exclusively what some counselors do, is work with people who are experiencing loss. And so what they're going to do there is just help you work through what you're feeling, what you're going through, connected to that loss. You know, what are those negative feelings? What are those negative behaviors and thoughts that you're having because of that loss? And the counselor is just going to talk with you. They're going to employ various techniques and methods to help you through um, your grief. And sometimes they're just going to listen to you. Sometimes they may throw out a technique like we talked about a few minutes ago, like square breathing. Sometimes they're just going to just be there with you, maybe give you a couple of tips here and there. But really, we just want to help you however you want to be helped. Whatever you Counselors, what we do, we believe that clients are the experts of their own lives, and we're just helping you get you where you already know where to go. We're just helping you pull it out. And so that's what we're going to do in grief counseling. Now, we talked about a lot of interventions. Well, before that, we actually talked about theories. So different counselors have different theories, like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy. We talked about those three in particular, and group therapy for grief. And if you have a CBT counselor, it may be a little bit different from someone who is a, a DBT counselor or a psychodynamic counselor, right? They may employ different techniques and different interventions. But I just kind of threw some of those in there a couple weeks ago, and we went over this just to kind of give you an idea of what you may see. Um, but generally, counselors are going to use some of these interventions here in grief counseling. So one would be cognitive restructuring. Cognitive restructuring is really a cognitive behavioral therapy technique where um, counselors will take a thought. So a thought like, I'm worthless, I'm never going to be worth anything without my wife. Okay. They're going to take that thought and they're going to reframe it, restructure it to something like, although my wife was very important to me and my identity, I am still special and I still have things to look forward to in life. And so it's just reframing and restructuring those negative thoughts, because the negative thoughts, like if you think that you're worthless and that no one cares about you or whatever, you're likely to act more negatively. So a counselor who's practicing CBT in particular is going to examine those thoughts and try to help you change them and reframe them, those negative thoughts. Mindfulness are really just practices that are kind of going to help you be mindful and to ground you in the present. And really to get you here in the here and now. And those practices that we've kind of talked about, like square breathing and the grounding techniques, those are mindfulness type things that are really going to help you get in the present and really focus on what you're feeling, be mindful and aware of what's going on in the here and now. A strengths based approach. This is where people are going to pull out, well, let me say this. A lot of times, I think in counseling, there's this idea that we focus on bad things or things that are going wrong. Well, what I like to do and what a lot of counselors like to do is to focus on what's going right. Instead of focusing on what you haven't done or what you think you can't do, we focus on your strengths. What have you done? What is going for you? What have you overcome before? And we use that, as kind of like a basis to move forward. Like, hey, you've done this before, you have strengths, you have these abilities that God's given you. How can we use those? So a strengths based approach, I think, is really encouraging for clients and helpful. Art, art is something that I don't do very often. Actually, never have I done that. But there are a lot of counselors who do art in therapy, and there's a lot that can come out while you're drawing. And a lot of thinking takes place during those times. Play, kind of the same thing for kids. Um, that's how they express themselves, is through play. And so a lot of things can come out during those times. And so sometimes counselors will employ these things to art and play to help people kind of get to talking and get deeper into conversation with them. Role playing, this can take a lot of different forms, but role playing is where the counselor and the client will take different roles, and they will kind of almost act it out. And I know it sounds a little strange, but role playing can be really, really powerful and really, really helpful. Um, so I think of like one role playing may be something like where the counselor takes the place of someone that the client has lost. And what if you had one last conversation with them? What would you say? And you kind of role play that way. And it can be a really powerful experience. That's just one example. Writing a letter to the deceased or about the loss. This is another really popular intervention that counselors may do, is just kind of help clients write about the deceased, write about what they lost. And that can be really, really helpful, because again, when we write, a lot of things can come out. All right. And something about putting things on paper can be really, really helpful. And then integration of faith. A lot of counselors, including myself, like to integrate faith into counseling, and that can be really, really helpful for a lot of clients. And so, um, those are just some of the things we talked about that you may see in counseling. Again, I'm not going to go over the theories, because counselors have different theories. And right today, a lot of counselors are kind of taking what's called a more an eclectic approach, meaning where they kind of take things from different theories, from cognitive behavioral theory, from gestalt theory, from psychodynamic theory, and kind of integrate it all into one. But I was just showing a couple weeks ago that if you have a therapist that is a cognitive behavioral therapist, what could you expect there? Well, I'm not going to go redo those. You can go back to that video and look at those. But this is just some of the things that we talked about with grief counseling. The next thing that we talked about, I think this was session 6 or 5 or 6, was, well, what can you do to support those who are grieving? Because what we had done up to session 5 or 6, whenever we did this one session, we had talked about, what we do, or what people feel when they go through grief, or what we as counselors will do helping people with grief. But I wanted to give people tools to help them help somebody else. Like, because grief touches a lot of people. It reaches a lot of people. A lot of people experience loss. And so you probably know someone who's lost something. What something or someone, what can you do to help them? And that's what we went over. So the do's and don'ts of supporting someone who is grieving. And we went over these are the don'ts first. Number one is don't feel like you have to speak. Right. Sometimes we feel like we've just got to say something, got to have the answers. You don't have to speak, right? You don't even have to say something sometimes. Sometimes just being there is enough and is more than enough. And so don't feel like you have to say something. Number two, don't use trite reassurances like time heals all wounds or they're in a better place now, right? Those things, while you may mean well in saying them, they may not be true for some people and they may not be helpful, right? It may not be what they want to hear, right? Time heals all wounds. Well, when you first experience loss, time slows down, and that doesn't really help them in that moment. They're in a better place now, right? Their loved one may not be in a better place, right? They may not believe that. So don't use those trite reassurances. Don't share your grief experience unless, I would say, unless it is a perfect opportunity and they ask for it, or you can just see like, okay, I got to capitalize on this and share a little bit of how I went through grief. What I mean by don't share your grief experience is don't make it about you. Don't turn it into something like here's how I went through it and oh man, I was so sad and so hurt. It's about them. And so if you're going to share your grief experience or part of it, use it as a way, a tool to help them, not as a way to kind of put it on to yourself. Don't compare their grief to someone else's grief, right? Everybody experiences it differently. And we don't want to put any more pressure on them to feel a certain way or to have to get through it like somebody else did, or for them to be focused on somebody else at that time. Because what they're going through is really, really tough. And they need to focus on trying to overcome themselves. Don't give them unsolicited advice. It's quick to, again, to give a quick fix, to give a quick word of advice. But here's the thing. Sometimes people don't want advice. Number one. Number two, if you give somebody advice without them asking, and even with them asking, sometimes advice doesn't work, right? As counselors, some people say, "Give me some advice," and we don't give advice. We're not supposed to, because our advice technically could not work, and they could come back and say, "Hey, you told me to do this, and it didn't work." So I know we mean well when we give advice, but sometimes it's not helpful. So don't give advice, especially if they don't ask. Don't tell them they're grieving incorrectly. That's the final one here. Don't tell them that, hey, you should have been at this point now by now, or hey, you need to get up off off your tail and start doing this A, B, C, or D, right? Don't push them when it's making them uncomfortable, right? Let them go at their own pace. Now, what I'm not saying is if they're sitting on their tails all day and they're not getting up and it's clearly hurting them. Well, yeah, we want to urge them to get up, but I guess what I'm saying is don't push them too quickly, and don't tell them that they're grieving in an incorrect way, because there really is no incorrect way of grieving. Now, here are some do's. Number one, show up regularly. Just be there. There is no price tag you can put on just being there with somebody who's hurting. Do listen carefully. Give them your ears. Just give them your ear. Listen to them. You don't even have to say anything. Just let them talk and just be there. Right there. There is again no price tag on just being there and giving them a listening ear. Number three, do offer practical assistance. This can be so very helpful, dropping off food, picking up kids, cleaning up the house, so on and so forth. Because let's face it, when we're hurting, when we're sad, the last thing we want to do is cook. The last thing we want to do is get out of the house and have to go to the school and pick up the kids or to clean up, right? And so offering that practical assistance can be really, really helpful for people who are struggling. Do respect their requests. If they request something of you, or if they request, hey, I just want to be alone for right now, or hey, I just want to do this, right? Respect their requests, right? Respect what they ask for. Now, if something's going to be detrimental to their health or to their well-being, we want to, help them see that and not let them do that. But within reason, we want to respect their requests. We also do want to seek professional help if needed. So watch out for some signs and like intense depression, signs and words of self-harm, and we really want to seek professional help if it's getting to that point. Don't let it continue, and let people kind of slip further and further. Seek professional help if needed. Not all people need professional help, but a lot of people do. And so be looking for some signs, and refer them to counseling. Refer them to us at Joanna Snow Ministries, or refer them to resources online. Do talk about the deceased. As uncomfortable as that may seem, it can actually be really helpful to talk about the deceased, and not to just act like it's that elephant in the room that's just kind of like a cloud over the room, and it's there and it's lingering there, but you don't say anything about it. Don't let that happen. It's okay to talk about the deceased. Bring up those fond memories. Talk about the thing that they lost, and that what it meant to them, right? That's really what it's about. What they're going through anyways is about that thing or that person. And so it's okay to talk about it. Do watch for depression and suicidal ideation. Kind of already touched on that with seeking professional help if needed. And then finally, do help to prepare with triggers. So we talked about triggers a little bit ago. And in triggers, when someone is triggered and those intense feelings come up because of hearing a certain song or going to a certain place or whatever, they may need to seek some support, and be ready at any time to receive a phone call or a text, and to help them through their grief. A couple more slides here. We're almost done. Um, the last thing we talked about a couple weeks ago was helping children who are grieving, and also faith, and how faith can be used with grief. Um, so children grieve differently than adults, right? They're just not the same. They're not at a cognitive space or an emotional space to deal with loss like adults do. They're not able. They don't have the capacity that adults do to work through things like we do, and so they're going to need a lot more help, and they're going to grieve a lot more differently. And so we looked at some things. We looked at the ways that children grieve differently. And so here's a slide here for what we need to do to help children who are grieving. What are some things that we can do? Well, number one is encourage and help them to express their feelings. So we want to encourage them. It's okay to feel, and we want to encourage them to show us what they're feeling and tell us how they're feeling. But also, they may not know, right? They may not know how to do that. So you might have to help them talk about it to express those feelings. Be developmentally appropriate, right? A 5-year old is not going to agree the same way as a 12-year old, right? And so we need to be developmentally appropriate, and stoop to their level and meet them where they are. Like, something more important for a 5-year old is going to be something like playing. Whereas a 12-year old, they're probably not going to be playing with dolls as much or at all at that point. And so you might have to do something a little bit different there. Um, by the way, this comes from childmind.org. The source is down there. I want to give credit where credit is due. But be developmentally appropriate. Be direct. Sometimes kind of beating around the bush can actually be more hurtful in the long run. And especially for younger kids who don't really understand, like, metaphors or figures of speech, right? That they may not understand those things. Like, even saying something like, "Hey, they passed away." They may wonder, well, what does it mean to pass away? Right? Especially, again, a little kid. I think older kids kind of understand that. But you might have to just be a little bit more direct and just talk about what has happened in a more direct fashion for them to understand. Discuss the funeral. Folks, funerals can be really scary things, and can be really kind of like a chilling experience for kids, especially if there's an open casket. And so to kind of prep them for that and kind of talk to them about that and what's going to happen and what it's going to be like there. A lot of people are crying most of the time at funerals. So it's important to discuss that, and to prepare them for what they could see or what could happen at the funeral. Discuss the afterlife. Right now, I know not everybody believes in the afterlife. I certainly do, as a Christian and as a minister. I do believe in the afterlife, and that's a big part of what a lot of people believe in. And within the Christian tradition, we believe that after this life, there is heaven for those who have been followers of Christ. And that can be really, really encouraging. Like, I believe I'm going to see my Mima and Papa one day in heaven, and that is a really encouraging thing. And so discussing that can be helpful if you do believe in those things. Don't ignore your own grief. Um, we do want to help our kids. We do want to help children work through their grief, But if you ignore your own grief and you start sliding, you're not going to be able to help them as much. So don't ignore your own grief. Make sure that you're still working on yourself too and addressing the feelings and the things that you're going through. And finally, stick to routines. Kids thrive on routine, thrive on kind of doing the same things. And the more things change, the harder it's going to be. And so the harder it's going to be for them to adjust. And so try to stick to routines as much as possible. If you need a little break, try to find like a grandparent or a friend to watch your kids to keep a routine going. So there's just some things to help children who are grieving. And then we also talked about faith and grief, right? I had a quote a couple weeks ago when we talked about this that said, and this was like actual research, a scholarly research talking about faith, and it showed basically that those who had some religious affiliation or faith, uh, uh, some faith background overcame the stages of grief or overcame feelings of grief quicker than those who had no ties to religion or faith. And again, there's some research out there that shows that faith can be really, really helpful in times of grief. And so um, we talked about that, and I encourage you, and I encourage you now to pursue religion and faith. It can be really, really helpful for these times and many other things. But here's what faith does. Faith, number one, provides a place to turn to in times of grief, right? As Christians, we believe we turn to God, we turn to His Word. Psalm 46:1 says that God is our refuge and strength and ever present help in trouble. And so it's a place to turn to when we're hurting, when we're in pain. We can turn to our faith and to our God and find help in time of need. Faith provides hope in the face of grief. Um, Again, there's a lot of hope-filled passages. There's a lot of um, passages about like the afterlife. We already talked about that, but like um, to believe that this is not the end. Like when we lose a loved one, this is not the end. We have hope of an eternal life with them, with our Lord, right? That can bring a lot of positive feelings here in the present. Faith provides encouragement in times of grief. Again, there are so many passages in Scripture that are encouraging that can help us push through and navigate this time of loss. So, finding that encouragement in faith and religion, and also in our church, right? We find encouragement from other people in our churches. And then finally, faith provides connection during times of grief. Number one, faith provides connection with God, and to know that God is always with us is something really, really comforting. But also provides connection again with people in our church, with other people who have the same faith as we do and the same religious practices as we do. And so it can be really, really helpful in times of grief to be religious and to have faith. And I know, again, not everybody is, but I would encourage you to pursue that, at least to start looking into it and not just to shrug it off, but we'll look into it and think about it a little bit more. It can really be helpful, not just for grief, but for a lot of things. And it can really, really improve our mental state in a lot of ways. So those are the things that we have talked about, and that was a really quick run through because we really spent almost an hour on each of those, and we didn't cover every slide that we've covered. But I hope that you have learned something in this group. If you have feedback, please send it to us. Let us know. Make a comment in the chat, or send us a an email or give us a call. I'd love to hear your feedback. And I'd love again if you would share these videos with somebody. If you would point them to these videos on our Facebook or YouTube pages, we'd really, really appreciate it. This could be really, really helpful for somebody who is struggling. And even if they get one thing and take it with them and help, that I think the job's been done. So please share this with others. And folks, I wanted to close by also saying again, at Joanna Snow Ministries, we're here to help. If you need help, let us know. We want to help you. We want to work with you. We want to get you through whatever you're going through. And we'll walk alongside you, and we will help you through the things that you're facing. So if you need us, reach out to us. But again, really appreciate you tuning in for these last several weeks, and really